All right, so good afternoon. This is my second video. My first video was basically about my, adolescent years. I gave as much as I could without making the video too long and boring. So now I'm going to just talk about my teenage years. So this is what led up to the path that I'm on now, which I believe to be a path of a watchman. So in my teenage years, I lived a life of sin. Now, again, I wrote it down just to keep from rambling on. So I lived a life of sin, which in turn caused a mess of demonic attacks and nightmares and oppression and, you know. During the course of my simple living, I did get pregnant. I got pregnant with my first son. My first son was born when I was 18 years old. Um, his life was plagued with sin and disappointment as well because of my sinful nature and because of the way I was living. So when he was born, unfortunately, he had a very rare genetic disorder, which affected his brain. He had a situation where the nerves or the coverings around the nerves of his brain was basically deteriorating slowly. And so he had a lot of genetic disorders. He didn't develop naturally. He never reached milestones. He just had a lot of issues. The doctors, they tried to call it all kind of things. They said, that he had something called Marie-Tooth syndrome. Then they said he had something named Pedras-Meckenbacher or some kind of genetic disorder. They never really could pinpoint exactly what it was, but it was a brain degeneration that they knew for sure. I did take him to see specialists when he was little, when he was a baby, and they said he would not see age 20. That he might make it through the teenage years, but he wouldn't see age 20. So, in knowing that, that set me on a path of destruction. It set me on, a path of sadness, depression, and which caused me to start drinking very heavily, using drugs, doing all the things that I shouldn't do, trying to like hide from the situation. At the time, I was living with my grandmother, so she kind of like helped me take care of him in the beginning. Like I said, they never really found the true diagnosis. Um, he suffered a lot of muscle weakness, which made it hard for him to walk. Uh, and then, it was just a difficult time for me. It was hard to hear that your child would not live, and then it was hard to see him suffering. I see I was just miserable because of it. By the time he was 5, my grandmother had inspired me to do something with my life, to not just sit here, sulking and being in grief and depression and sadness over his diagnosis. So for the first 5 years of his life, I was on welfare. I didn't do anything with my life. I didn't aspire to be nothing. I just was depressed. I just drank and, did all the wrong things. So finally, I did get a job and I started to feel just a tiny bit better about myself. Um, I got a job working in a casino. And then, when you first get a job in a casino, you're working like the worst shift possible. So at that time, I was working midnight to 8 in the morning. And because of the late hours, I didn't see my son, of course, through the night. And then in the day, I was sleeping when I was off of work. So my grandma was pretty much raising him, which was probably the best thing at the time because I really didn't have what I needed to raise a child. And you say God don't give you kids unless, he makes you able to take care of them or gives you what you need to take care of them. So I probably could have, but I just wasn't inspired. I had the enemy working against me and I just wasn't doing the right thing for him or myself. I started working at night, like I said, and then I finally got my own place and I was able to move out. And, my grandma suggested it's probably best to leave him with her because I'm working all night and I'm sleeping all day. And, because of his sickness and his issues, he needs somebody to be with him around the clock, just to make sure everything, was okay with him. And, she was retired and she could be with him all the time. So I said, okay, that'll work. So eventually, I started, well, I was going to see him every morning after I got up for work at 8. I would stop at my grandmother's house and check in on him. And then, it became difficult to see him like that, to see him sick. And it started to just make more sense for me not to come because it was just so depressing. When I was away from him working, my mind was not on it, and I was just focused on trying to do something for myself, not really thinking about this depressed situation that I really had, that I had with my child in his life. So eventually, I stopped visiting less and less. And my grandma continued to take care of him. I did not realize that, that I wasn't with him like I should. It just seemed like it was the right thing for me to do for my life. To see him suffering, and not reaching milestones, to see him not, growing like other kids and being able to be in regular school, it was just difficult. And then to have this prognosis of death, this diagnosis that he's going to die, it was just difficult to raise him and be around him. So, he stayed with my grandmother. He was happy with her. And then, as I realized later on in life, but I'll tell you, every time I did go and visit him, I noticed that he would just lay down on the couch or lay down on the bed and say he was so sick. And then my grandmother would say, hey, he wasn't laying down until you got here. He later told me, as an adult, because, he lived, he later told me that there was something that used to tell him that looked like him, that used to tell him that when I come around to lay down and act like you're sick, so I won't want to come around. So he did that, but I didn't know that at the time. So all he did was keep me away from him. So eventually I met a man. We did get married. We had 3 other children. So I started to bring him home with me so that he can get to know his brothers and sisters, on the weekends. And then I would drop him back off at my grandmother's house so that, he could go to school there. So that worked out well for a while. It was okay. And then at age 16, my grandmother got sick and she passed away. So then he had to come home with us, full time. So in the beginning, things were okay, but then I noticed that he started to deteriorate. Like and then I realized now that he probably was not, because the enemy sometimes will trick you into seeing things that ain't so. You got to be careful with sometimes what your eyes see because it ain't always the truth. But anyway, especially if you don't have spiritual eyes, especially if you're not looking at it in the spirit. But anyway, I saw him as deteriorating, so it caused my depression to come back. And then it got so he wasn't able to use the restroom on his own. And every time he did, he would just make a massive mess. And I had to clean up all of that, and it was difficult. And then I started having these nightmares. I would have these nightmares, and it was every single night about dirty bathrooms, about waste, about, oh, it was so disgusting. It was traumatizing to me. And it would occur every single night to the point I couldn't stomach to be in any kind of dirty situation. I couldn't even be around him because he was always still just making a mess. And it got so my husband and my children had to keep him clean and take care of him. I couldn't even stomach to be around him. I just couldn't. I did not realize it at the time, but I would get angry and yell at him for making this mess because not even considering that there was things going on with him, with his mind, and that he had stuff going on. I couldn't stomach being around it because of the trauma that the enemy was putting me through at night, these nightmares. So anyway, that was at age 16. At age 20, I then became anxious again because they said he wouldn't see age 20, but he was now 20 years old. So like I said, I noticed that he was starting to deteriorate, and he was withdrawn, and he was alone, and it was a lie, and it went on for many years. Me and him did not have a good relationship. We did not have a good life. I couldn't stomach to be around him because of the bathroom issues. They seemed to intensify every time I would come home from work. He didn't have any friends. He couldn't walk very well, so he didn't go out the house because he started to use a walker. Now he lives now, he's 30, 10 years passed, and he's still alive. So, I started to get anxious, and I realized that I was starting to pray again. I haven't done that since a child. God then started to draw me back in, and draw me back in, and draw me back in. And I remember I was watching something, a pastor or preacher or some kind of sermon or whatever on YouTube, and I remember someone saying, you need to ask God to open your spiritual eyes that you will see things as they are, because when you're living in sin, the enemy will fool you, will blind you, will. So, I did that. I said, God, please open my eyes to see the truth of things. Please open my eyes to see my son. Please open my eyes. Now I didn't know how to pray. I didn't have any, I could only say the basics like, oh, God, help me, help me. Oh, please open my eyes. So that was the first time I ever prayed anything other than that. So I asked God to open my eyes. And I'm telling you, it was like, it wasn't even a second. It was immediately. Right then and there, I realized, oh my God, what have I done? Where's my son? What is going on? Like, I immediately recognized that something is wrong. So I raced into his room, and I sat down next to him, and I looked at him, and I realized that he was alone. He was withdrawn. He was sickly looking. He was thin. He was just nothing I just didn't recognize who he was. And then I also realized that I hadn't looked at him in years. He was dirty. He wasn't put together. He just, So I said, oh God. And then I screamed his name, and I said, are you okay? What's the matter? And he did not even look at me. He did not even look at me. So, yeah. So then I realized that, that there has been so many years that I have just let his life just slip by, our lives just slip away, and I didn't realize that he was in pain, and that we were all in just, I don't know, just under demonic attack, and we were being controlled by the enemy. I didn't realize that. So I sat next to him. Now I don't need the paper for this because this is all fresh and new. Um, so I sat next to him, and I held his hand, and he never looked at me, and I just held his hand, and I realized I need to clean him up. So I started cleaning him up, and buying him all fresh new clothes and feeding him healthy foods and stuff. And I noticed that he was actually starting to gain a little weight. He was looking better. And then I went into some serious prayer for him, the best that I could pray. I didn't really have much words because I was still bound up by the enemy, and I couldn't really voice what I was feeling. Like, I just didn't have no words, almost like I was shut down, and the enemy wouldn't let my voice be heard, wouldn't let me say the things I wanted to say. But I started praying for him the best I could. And the very first night I prayed is when the demonic attack started, the attacks that I spoke about in my first video that would come between the hours of 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. So that first night was the first time I experienced it. I woke up at three on the dot, and there was something standing in my room that I could not visually see, but I could feel. I could spiritually see. So I didn't know what it looked like, but I know it was nothing of God. So, I had the attack. It felt like, I guess what the doctors would probably say, anxiety attack, but that is definitely not what it was. My grandma used to go through it too, and at that time they called it angina, but it feels as if your heart is going to bust out at your chest, that there is a paralyzing fear that has just taken you over. You can't move, you're shaking, and it's just awful. And it would go on from 3 to 5, and this went on for a good year. But anyway, I had that happen, and that was the first night. So I said, oh God, what is going on? Like, this is the first time I had it. I said, this must be like, a nightmare. Maybe I wasn't awake, but I know that I was. So then the second night, that day I prayed for him like I usually did, tried my best with him, praying, saying the words that I could think to say. And that night, at 3 o'clock, I woke up. I had the demonic attack. Something was standing there. I couldn't see it, standing by my door. It would, traumatize me, my heart beating on my chest, whole thing. And I used to have this alarm clock with this old phone that had this alarm clock on it that you could set. Instead of it ringing or buzzing or making an alarm sound, it would say, hey, it's 4 a.m. or it's 5 a.m. it's 6 a.m. So I would get up at 5 because I had to go to work at 7. So I would fight with this thing all night and I would be up. So I'm just waiting for my clock to go off, so that I know that the attack would end. And 5 on the dot, instead of it saying, hey, it's 5 a.m., it said, stay out of it, stay out of it, stay out of it. And I said, stay out of what? And I thought, oh God, they're talking about my son. So I went to work and I prayed the best I could, saying all I could say, praying, praying, praying for him. And that third night, I came in and went to bed, woke up at 3, and I mean, it was the worst attack I ever felt in my life. I mean, to the point I felt like I would hit the floor. I felt like I was dying. I couldn't walk. I jumped up. I ran into his room to check on him. And what he said is, it's going to kill you. It's going to do to you what it did to grandma. And my grandmother, when she passed in a state of paralysis, as if when she passed, the doctor said that she had some pinched nerves and stuff that could have easily been fixed, but they didn't know of them. But that is what was paralyzing her body. Like her feet were paralyzed and her legs and on up until she was gone over the course of like 3 or 4 years before it paralyzed her completely. But he told me that is what the enemy was going to do to me. So I said, no, it's not. And that was on a Saturday. Sunday morning, I said, we're going to church. So, I called my job, I called out of work. Now, my grandma used to have this prayer group that used to come over to the house, and I remembered one lady's name, so I sought her out and found out, where she was and what church she went to. So I got in contact with her. She invited us to the church. So I called out of work, like I said, and I got my son ready to go to the church. Now, it took 5 hours to do something that should have been easily done within an hour. But I spent 5 hours trying to get us ready. So I want to tell you, getting him out of this door was something from the horror movie, something you cannot even imagine. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. So I got him dressed, and we're standing in this door here, and he's holding on to the door frame, and I'm outside the door with my hands under his arms trying to pull him out. I'm like, come on, what are you doing? And I see with my own eyes his legs lifted up about this far off the ground, like they were dangling like that, and something was pulling him to keep him from leaving this house. And I was just blown away. I didn't know what to say, and just my first instinct was scream, blood of Jesus. So I screamed, the blood of Jesus, loud as I could do it, and then it let loose him, and he fell out. So we started going to church. I was taking him to church, and then probably about a good 2 or 3 times, 3 weeks later, he started to talk again. And he sat on the end of his bed, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed, and we could see each other from the doorway, and he said, I want to talk to you. And I said, okay. I was just surprised because he hadn't been talking. And he said, you know how I'm always talking to myself and you say, stop talking to yourself? I said, yes. He said, well, I'm not talking to me. I'm talking to this thing in here that looks like me. He said, it's his friend. He said it was the same thing that used to tell him to lay down and act like he was sick. So I said, oh, no, 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 that's very wrong. He said, well, no, it says it's my friend. And he said it was something evil inside of him. I said, what is evil inside you? He said, it's something in me that tells me to strangle everybody, to kill y'all, and after y'all dead, it's going to take me to the demonic church. He said, but I'm not going to do that, but that's what it tells me to do. So I said, oh, God, we're in trouble. So so then I called the lady from the church, the one that from my grandma's prayer group, and I told her everything that my son had said. And she said, you need to start bringing him to this prayer meetings that we have on Tuesday. They have a noonday prayer. So I changed my days off at work to Sunday and Tuesday, so I could take him to church and then go to the prayer meeting on Tuesday. So I started taking him there. And then I noticed that things started to improve with him just a bit. just a bit. I noticed he didn't look as sickly. And he started seeing that thing less and less. But there were still other things that he was saying and doing. Sometimes he would wake up in different places and he didn't know how he got there. He'd go to sleep and then he'd wake up out in the living room and he didn't know how he got there. So I was concerned that, I don't know if anything was going to try to manipulate. I didn't know what was going to happen. So I was afraid. So I sat on my bed and I prayed and I asked God the best that I could, Lord, please, Jesus. I said, when my grandmother was here, we didn't have this problem because they were so close to you. I said, now that they're with you, Father, whatever you have given them, whatever you had given them, give it to me, Father God, so that I can use whatever that gift was to help Chris. Please give it to me. Give it to me, Father. So anyway, I didn't know what I asked for. I didn't know what I was asking God. I had no idea about mantles and really about I had no idea what I asked for. And I didn't know that there's a price to pay for the things that I just didn't know what I asked for. So anyway, that night, well maybe that afternoon, after I had prayed that, I laid down. I used to keep my husband has a daughter, my stepdaughter. She has a child. I used to babysit him while she goes to work. So I used to get up, after work I'd take a few minute nap because, that thing would keep me up all night. And, I'd make his dinner. So I remember I was taking a nap on the bed and I had asked that before I took the nap. And then, I went to sleep. And when I woke up, my intention was to ask him, are you ready for your dinner? But instead of saying that, I yelled out into the atmosphere my grandmother's name. I'm not going to say her name, but I yelled out, Jane Doe! And I thought, what did I say that for? So then he asked me, he said, who is, Jane Doe? And I wanted to say, well, that's my grandmother. But before I could say that, instead of me saying that's my grandmother, I then yelled my great-grandmother's name. I just yelled it out into the atmosphere, Jane Doe! And I thought, I got up, I said, what in the world am I saying that for? So I didn't think nothing more of it, whatever. I didn't even think about what I had asked God for. So I had started making a practice out of going into my son's room at night and praying with him before he went to sleep because I didn't want him to see this thing that looked like him. I was trying to help him, protect him. So I would go in there, I would do the Psalms 91, a protection verse, and then I would do the Lord's Prayer, and then I would say the best prayer I could. So I went in there that night for him to go to bed, and I did the Psalms 91, I did the Lord's Prayer, and then I held my hands up like this, and I tried to pray the best words that I could come up with. And, immediately after I started, he yelled, ah! So I said, oh, God, what's the matter? I opened, and I saw he was drawn way back like that. I said, what's the matter? And he said, I don't like that fire. I said, what fire? And he said, right here in this hand, you got grandma. And over here in this hand, you got great-grandmother. I don't like that fire. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, when I was a little boy, I used to see that fire and I used to be afraid, but I got used to it. But now all of that together with that fire you got, I don't like it. I'm scared. It's dangerous. So I'm just like confused. It didn't even occur to me till I went into my room to say my regular prayer and say, hey, did God give me what I asked for? But anyway, I grabbed his hand and I started praying. I said, come on, let's pray. So I just took his hand to pray, and then he just yanked away from me, and he said, that burns, don't touch me. That went on for about a month. Then he said that my hands were burning his. I couldn't even touch him. It was hard to get him ready, dress, feed him, because my hands were burning him. So he told me that this fire that I have here, that it's disturbing and he's afraid of it. But I didn't realize, I said, well, this fire that I have now is going to be what gets you straight. It's going to be what helps you. But so that's the start of my story with my son. There's so much more to it, but it would take hours to tell it. Like I said, I'm going to break the videos up. But this is just a start, and this is when I was very, very young in the Lord. I mean, very young, where, like I said, I couldn't pray. I didn't have any insight at all. I had no spiritual discernment. I just had eyes to see, because I asked for it, and God gave them to me. But in my next video, I'll explain exactly what happened next. Things got very, very, very strange, what most people would call it. But I realized that it was things that needed to happen. It is what led me to this point that I'm at now. But I just ask that you pray and that you keep God close. I know the world is just like inviting you to do everything but serve God. Everything around you seems more easy, but it is not. Let me tell you, there is nothing out here for you but sin in the pits of hell. The enemy is a liar. Everything that he tells you, everything that you see that they say is accepting, all the good now is bad and all the bad now is good, all it'll do is land you in hell. Pray and ask God to open your mind, open your eyes to see, your ears to hear, to give you the right perception, that you will perceive correctly, that you will have heightened spiritual discernment. We all still have a lot to learn, but I'm just so grateful for what God has done in my life. I tell you, I can't thank him enough for keeping me when I didn't keep myself, for blessing me, for keeping me alive when the enemy came in to take me down, how he protects me through the night when the enemy comes in to try to destroy me, how he sent angels to protect my family, how he's protect my home. I'm just so grateful to God, and I'm gonna make these videos, no matter how strange people may think they seem, how crazy they may sound to people. I know it's real, and I know there's somebody out there that might be going through the same thing. There's people out here that are suffering. I know it is, because the enemy is wicked. I can guarantee he ain't just messing with me. If he ain't messing with you, let me tell you, then you are lost. You are lost, because anybody he ain't messing with, then he feels no need to, and that's not a good sign. But anyway, so that's all I have to say for this video. But thanks for listening. Thanks for taking time out your day. I hope this will be a blessing to someone. I hope somebody will wake up today. I hope somebody will find their way to God. Let me tell you something. He loves you all. He loves us all. He loves you all, and he's just waiting for you to let him in. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.